Welcome to this, the final session, at least the final session as far as I am counting things, session 8 of our ACCA P3 course. The numbering is going to be number 15 and 16 for these two, but as far as I'm concerned, it's the final session. And in this particular session, we are going to be looking at strategic change. That is project management, which is one of the examiner's favourite areas. We get this over and over again, and change management. The question that we will be looking at is December 2010, question 4. So that's the one that we will be looking at as part of this. So let's remind ourselves. We have done strategic analysis. We have done strategic choice. We've done strategic implementation. Now, all of those in the exam involve some kind of change. It could be changing our strategy. Chapter 2 up to chapter 9, where we do the analysis and we do the choice. It could be changing the way we implement something, changing our training, changing our culture, changing a business process. It could be that kind of change, so chapter 10, 11, 12, 13. But pretty much everything that we do in P3, as far as the exam is concerned, is going to lead towards some kind of change, because otherwise it'd be a very boring exam. What do they need to do? Nothing. It's all perfect. Can I have 50%, please? So everything in P3 is all about some kind of change. So that means we could analyse things correctly. We could make the right choice, but we could implement the changes that will be required. If we do market development or product development, there will be changes required, and maybe we do that poorly. And so our strategy doesn't ever really work because we didn't look at the change properly. Or perhaps we've worked out there's a business process that we're not doing very well. We've worked out using Harman a better way of doing it, but we need to change from this way of doing it to that way of doing it, and we manage that change pool, and it ends up perhaps that the new business process never really gets introduced, or it perhaps doesn't work. We thought it would do and it doesn't. So this is also a key part of strategy, getting from what you're doing now to what you want to do in the future. I would be incredibly surprised, unless you work for a really, really, really small company, I would be incredibly surprised if any of you, and I would include me in this, if any of you are working for a company that is not changing something at the moment. Even if it's something fairly minor, I bet every single company that is worked for by you or by me, somebody is changing something. So it's an incredibly important part of the syllabus. It's again a very practical part of the syllabus. So we're going to have a look at chapter 14 and chapter 15. Chapter 14 is about project management. Now, project management in the exam is usually, not always, but it's usually linked to changing business processes. Not always, but usually. So the idea is that we've got a business process, we're going to do business process re-engineering, we're going to do business process redesign, we're going to have a bespoke system, because that's what Harman has recommended rather than having it done by people. We're going to change the way that we do a business process, and if we get it wrong, if we do the change badly, if we run the project badly, then it is all going to be a complete disaster. So project management is very, very important. And as I say, your examiner likes project management. We get a lot of project management questions. So December 2014 talks about, you can see here, the principles of scope, time and cost on projects. So December 14, June 14, June 13, June 12, December 11, blah, 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 blah. You can see how often this comes up. It's a very regular kind of topic. Before we talk about project management, we need to make sure we're happy with what we mean by a project. A project is simply something you're going to do that is going to have a definite end date. And you need to do something where there is a goal, an objective that you need to achieve. So you have to achieve a particular objective by a particular deadline. So you have a task to fulfill within a certain deadline. Not only that, you have a budget you have to stick to, and there are various qualities, there are various standards that you have to achieve. So a project is simply something you have to achieve this by this date, spend less than that amount of money, do it to this particular standard. That's all a project is. Project management is simply making sure that you do that. Now, project management is incredibly important to you. Partly because it's one of the examiner's favourite topics, but more importantly than that, the P3 exam. What is the P3 exam? I would argue it is 3 projects. Question 1 and then 2 of the optional questions. Because what is an exam question? What is the examiner asking you to do? He is saying, here is your objective. You have to do this task for me. You have to do this project for me. You have to analyse this or explain that or evaluate something. The requirement says, here's the objective. The number of marks you've got gives you the deadline. You must finish this bit in 45 minutes. You must finish that bit in an hour and a half. So you've got to do the task the examiner has given you within the time. You must also do an answer that is of a good enough standard for the marker to be able to give you any marks for it. And a good way to think about it is, are you adding any value to the scenario? If all you're doing is repeating what the examiner has told, you're not really analysing anything. Are you adding value? Are you saying because? If you do what the examiner wants and you do it within the right deadline and you add some value so you've done it to the right standard, you will pass. I guarantee it. Why do people fail the exam? Why do people fail P3? As a marker, I can tell, and I've said this at the beginning, I've marked 3,500 plus scripts. People fail because they don't do what the examiner asked them to do. They don't mention the company that's in the exam, or they just give an essay about something. They don't do what they're supposed to, so they haven't met the goal of the project. They take too long. A lot of students do a very good answer to question 1 that must have taken 2 hours. Then they do a very good answer to question 2 which takes another hour, and then that's all they do, and they fail the exam. So they don't meet the goal, they don't meet the deadline, or all they're doing is just repeating things out of the scenario. They're not adding anything, so I can't give them any marks. As I said earlier, the paper is called business analysis. It's not called business copying things out. So that's the reason people fail. Their technical knowledge will be fine, but they fail because they're poor project managers. Now, one of the things I hope you will be able to do is I hope you'll be able to do a revision course with us, because revision is very much to do with project management. It's very much to do, if I was to say exam technique is another word for project management, as far as you guys are concerned. So the revision is very much exam technique. It's very much about project management. Now, the examiner says that there are a number of stages that a project goes through. There are a number of stages that a project goes through, and at each of these stages, you have the opportunity to say, you know what, let's abandon the project here. It's going to be too difficult. For whatever reason, let's abandon it here. Now, in the exam, they do not go through the 5 stages that I've just highlighted. They don't do that. What they do is they just get on with the project, and at the end, they end up with something that hasn't worked. And the exam question is almost always something like, how could, having done one of these things, how would it have helped? And it will help because you'll avoid the problems that the project actually had. So your examiner is a big believer in these. So let's go through what the different stages are. The first stage, which to be honest is usually taken for granted in the exam, although not always. Back in December 2007 there was a question where this was actually the big problem. Initial screening is basically saying, why are we doing this project at all? In the December 2007 exam, it was question 4 in December 2007's exam, you had a company and they sold clothes on the internet. And the marketing manager said, you know what, our website, it's a bit old-fashioned. And so we should update it. We should make it look a bit more contemporary. And they do, you know, the marketing manager and various others, but they did lots of things, and basically they launched a redesigned website and it crashed straight away, and the company spent $50,000, $60,000, I think it was, doing this new website. It didn't work, and the very next day they went back to the old website again. And the examiner said, where did they go wrong? Where did this company go wrong? One of the reasons they went wrong is, even though the marketing manager said it's old-fashioned, it wasn't ever really clear what was old-fashioned about the website. It wasn't ever really clear why they needed a new website at all. And because it wasn't really clear why they were doing this project at all, the project was never going to work. So initial screening, make it very clear, why are we doing this at all? So, things to look for in the exam. What weaknesses is the project trying to fix? And you must be specific. If you simply say the website looks out of date, that is not specific enough. You need to say why making it look up to date would increase sales, and what exactly you mean by up to date. So because the marketing manager wasn't specific enough, this project didn't work. Similarly, what's wrong with what we're doing at the moment? You and I all know that there are times when the companies we work for spend money on doing something new, and you think, why? Why did you bother doing that? What we were doing was okay. There's nothing wrong with what you're just doing something new for the sake of doing something new. So what's wrong with the Covenant approach? If you cannot answer those questions, abandon the project. And at least if you abandon it now, you haven't wasted too much time on it. The marketing manager, they spent, I think, a year, £50,000+ on something that didn't work. And I could have told them that at the end of day one, it wasn't going to work. At the end of one meeting, it isn't going to work because you don't really know what's wrong with the Covenant website. So initial screening. Risk assessment. What might go wrong with the project? Well, remember that a project has 4 different bits to it. The scope, what you're trying to achieve, the time, the deadline you've got, the quality, the standards you have to achieve, and how much money you've got. What happens if you break any of those 4? So, what happens if you do a project and it doesn't actually meet the objectives? What could happen? Well, if you're doing it for a client, then you'll get sued. If you're perhaps doing it to try and increase sales, then maybe sales won't increase. Maybe you'll upset your customers. What happens if it's late? Are there going to be penalties imposed on you? And if so, how serious are they going to be? What happens if what you do upsets the customers? You haven't done it properly, so you've annoyed the customers. What happens then? And finally, what happens if you spend too much money? Now, with any project, those are the things that could go wrong. So you may remember, we looked at it earlier, TARA, transfer accept, reduce, avoid. Now, a good example of a project, my wife and I have just had some painting done in our house. We've had our living room redecorated, repainted. Now, if the painter hadn't done what we would try to be very clear with what we wanted him to do, but if he'd done something different, we'd have said, no, come back and do it again, and we're not paying you for it. So come back and do what you should have done. So what he did was he reduced the risk of that by checking what we wanted. So he would keep saying, is that what you want? Are you sure that's what you want? And we would say, yep, that's okay. So at the end of it, he had done what we had wanted him to. He reduced the risk of it. Time. If he was late, if he took too long to do the project, if he took too long to do the painting, then he would have ended up having to stay and finish our work and basically not get paid for it because he paid us a rate. He gave us a quote rather. He just said, I'll do the whole room for this amount of money. The longer he spent, the more it cost him. He wouldn't have got any extra money. So there was a risk that he was late. There was a risk that he would have upset us. It might not have been the painting. It might have been that he didn't clear up after himself or that he damaged some of the furniture. So again, he reduced the risk of that by making sure all the furniture was covered. He spent a long time clearing up at the end of each day and making sure we were happy at the end of each day. Is that okay before I leave? So he reduced as many of these risks as he could do. Now, he has a choice. He can either say, I can't reduce the risks anymore, but I think I will be okay. I'm going to do what the client wants. I'll probably meet the deadline. I'll do it as to the standard that they want. And if I go a little bit over budget, it's not going to be a problem because I've built some profit in. And he can say, okay, I'm happy to go ahead. I'll accept that. Or he would say, no, there's still too big a risk it goes wrong. I'm going to avoid that. I'll say no. So when we go to the painter, he simply says, no, I'm not going to do that. Sorry, I'll go and ask somebody else. So the idea is that you identify what would go wrong if you didn't meet these constraints, and then you try and reduce the chance that that will happen. Now, if I go back up to the exam questions, that's basically what the December 2014 question is about. What happens if things might go wrong? What would the implications be for the companies in the scenario? And the idea was for the companies in the scenario, for one of them, the time is a really, really big deal. If they were late doing something, it's got really big consequences. And for the other one, I seem to remember it was the budget was the big deal. So you try and reduce the chance that something goes wrong. And if you can't reduce it enough, you simply say, we're not going to do it then. We'll avoid it. So if something, you could have a project that fails the initial screening. I don't really see why we're doing it, so let's not do it. You could have a project where you think there's too many things could go wrong, and if they go wrong, it's going to be too expensive. Let's avoid that problem. Let's avoid that risk. Let's not do the project at all. Now, again, in the exam, they don't do that. They go ahead with the project and it all goes horribly wrong, and you come along and say, I could have told you that. I could have told you it was going to go wrong. If only you'd done it the same way that David is doing it in his notes, you'd have identified this earlier and you wouldn't have had the same problem. Something that comes up a lot, and it's something we've seen already. We've seen this in Chapter 8. When we did the question in Chapter 8 to do with Ray buying the machine, we actually were looking at a business case. Now, I could have put that question here. I decided to put it in Chapter 8 so that I had all the numbers in one place. That was my thinking. But it could just as easily have gone here. If we're going to do a business case, this means the company needs to think about, is this project going to give us more benefits than it does costs? Are we going to be better off at the end of the project than we are now? And the person that gets involved with that is somebody called the project sponsor. The project sponsor is a senior person, and their department will benefit at the end of the project if everything works. Now, a project sponsor then, this is like Project sponsors like the client. This is who you're doing the work for. Now, it has to be somebody whose department's going to benefit, because otherwise they won't care. So it has to be something that they care whether it works or not. So if I was a project sponsor for something to do with the MBA department at LSBF, I don't work for the MBA department. I don't know who does. I don't even know where they're based. I think I said that to you in a previous lecture. So you say, right, you're the project sponsor. If the project works well, the MBA department will benefit. Well, I don't care. So I'm not going to work very hard to make sure this project is a success. So you should have somebody who will be affected. If the project works, they will benefit. Their department will benefit. They will care. They will get involved. It needs to be somebody senior. It needs to be somebody who can get things done. It might well be, we need some more money. I'm senior enough, I can give you some more, I can allocate a bigger budget to you. We need some more staff. I am senior, I can make sure you get some more workers. In the exam, they may well put the wrong person in charge of the project. They may well have the wrong project sponsor. And again, to a certain extent, this was the problem with the marketing manager being the project sponsor in 2007's question 4. They wouldn't directly benefit if the website was done better or not. So they weren't really that bothered about whether it worked or not. Now, remember when we talked about the Ray question back in chapter 8, we said you need to choose the right method. So in the exam, they may have already done a business case, they may have done an NPV, they may have done a payback period, and you have to come along and say, for this particular situation, I think that's the wrong way to do it. Or, I think it's okay what you've done. It's usually they've done it the wrong way, but occasionally they do it right. So I think you've done it the wrong way because, or it could be, I think you've done it the correct way. I am happy with the method you've used, but I do not agree with the numbers that you are putting in. And if you remember, this was one of the problems with Ray. If you remember, in Ray's calculation of the payback, the very last line was energy savings. And it said in the scenario that Ray and his company, they only knew the energy usage of the factory. They didn't know about each machine. And yet they came along and said, this machine is going to save this amount of energy. They were just guessing. They couldn't possibly have known that. So Ward and Daniels say you must be very careful when you're thinking about the kinds of numbers that you put into your NPV or into your payback or whatever it happens to be, because if you put in numbers that aren't really very good, they're not correct, they're guesses like Ray used, then whatever method you use isn't going to help you to make a decision. So we said with Ray used payback, we didn't like payback, we could have done an NPV. Wouldn't have made any difference. Ray is still guessing at the numbers he's putting in there. So Ward and Daniels say, look, there are 4 types of benefits to put in a cost-benefit analysis. The costs are usually relatively straightforward to identify. So costs are usually fairly easy to say, okay, there is the cost of this, there's the cost of this, there's the cost of this. But benefits are much trickier to identify. Now, let me give you an example. Imagine that my wife and I are thinking of changing our car. Both my wife and I, we both drive, we both have cars, but we're thinking of changing a car. And we have been told, at the moment, we both have petrol cars, and we've been advised that we should buy a diesel car. Now, diesel cars are more expensive to buy. So we have to decide whether we should buy a diesel car or whether we should buy another petrol car. We can put in the extra cost. That's easy to identify. There's the price of the petrol car, there's the price of the diesel car. The diesel is more expensive. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis, maybe even some kind of NPV, So we need to put in things like savings. And so here are the sort of things that people will say. They will say that if you drive a diesel car, the ride that you have is smoother. Now, I don't even really understand what that means, but that's what we've been told. They'll say, oh, it's a smoother ride. I think that means you get less sort of jolts and things like that. But anyway, it's a smoother ride. That's fine. How do we put that into a net present value calculation? Because how do you measure that? An observable benefit is one that you really can't measure accurately. So Ward and Daniels say that kind of thing, that kind of benefit cannot go in an NPV because you really can't measure it very easily. A typical one we have in the exam will have things like staff motivation or staff morale. Well, how do you measure that? So an observable benefit is one you can't measure. Buy a diesel car, it's a smoother ride. Well, yeah, what does that mean? Can't measure it. A measurable benefit is one that you can measure, but you can really only measure it at the end. It is very difficult. So you can measure something now and you can measure something at the end, but it is very difficult to try and predict. It's very difficult to try and predict in advance how much something is going to improve by. Now, an example of this will be petrol consumption. Diesel cars usually use less petrol than petrol cars do. Now, that's just one of these things that's a fact. It just is. We could be told, right, buy a diesel car and you'll use less petrol. We would be able, now my wife tends to drive the same journey to work each day because she drives from the house to work and then back again. She knows how much petrol she uses at the moment. She will be able to measure how much petrol she uses driving a diesel. She will know afterwards how much less petrol she used. But it's very difficult to say now, before we even buy the car, you will save this amount of petrol. We honestly don't know. We will be able to measure it after it's happened. But it's very difficult to measure it in advance. So Ward and Daniels say, you're basically guessing, aren't you? Now that's like the energy one that Ray had in his machine. Ray would be able to say, oh, we've used less energy, haven't we? But he'd only know that at the end. He doesn't know now what it's going to be. He's guessing. So a measurable benefit, you can notice it afterwards, but it's difficult to predict. A quantifiable benefit. A quantifiable benefit, you can predict it, you can measure it, but it's difficult to work out in money terms how much it's going to be worth. Now, this is important because remember, in an NPV, we are putting in money. The costs are in terms of money. So we need to have benefits that are also in terms of money. Now, again, let's imagine that, what my wife does is she gets lent a diesel car for a day, drives to and from work. So she works out how much petrol she uses in the diesel versus how much petrol she uses in a petrol car. Right, now we can predict exactly how much less petrol we're going to use. All she's got to do is say, I saved a litre a day, 5 days a week, 5 litres a week, 20 litres a month, etc., etc. We can work that out. How much money is that going to save us a year? I don't know, because I don't know what the price of petrol is going to be. I don't know what the price of diesel is going to be. It's going to go up and down during the year. So it's a quantifiable thing. I could work out how much less fuel we will use, but I don't know what the financial savings are going to be because it depends on what the price of oil does. So Ward and Daniels say, you can't put that one in either. So Ward and Daniels say, look, you can't put in benefits that you can't measure. You can't put in benefits that you can't predict. You can't put in benefits that are not in financial terms. And I have to say I have a lot of agreement with Ward and Daniels. The only benefits you can put in are financial ones where you can measure it, you can predict it, and it's in terms of money. Those benefits you can include. Now, the trouble is, if my wife and I are thinking, should we spend more money on a diesel car? Virtually all the benefits Ward and Daniels say we can't put in. So we'd end up with an extra cost. We probably wouldn't end up with any benefits in there at all. So we would say no. We would say, right, on a purely financial basis, we're not going to buy a diesel car because Ward and Daniels won't let us put in all the benefits. And I can understand why they would do that. Now, the key thing then is if you're looking at a project and you've included observable benefits and measurable benefits and quantifiable benefits, you have got a lot more benefits in there that Ward and Daniels say you shouldn't really be putting in. So your net present value is going to be better because you're including things that shouldn't be included. Now, to me, this is obvious. You should only put in things where you can actually predict accurately the financial impact. And yet, organisations, governments even, do this all the time. At the time I am filming this, one of the things hasn't been in the news for a while, but it has been in the news. They're talking about building a new high-speed train link between London and Birmingham. And obviously that's going to have a big cost. So the government has been doing a cost-benefit analysis and it's come up with benefits. One of the benefits that the government has identified, or the people who did the report have identified, is the fact that people will be more productive because they get to work faster. Now, I would say that's an observable benefit. It might be a measurable one. You might be able to measure how much extra work they get done. But I suspect for most people you couldn't measure it accurately. So this and the high-speed 2 train link is, if they go ahead with it, it's going to cost billions, not millions, but billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And they're potentially including things in their cost-benefit analysis that you would not allow to be put in a P3 exam. So governments do this all the time. Your company has done it. Now, the big problem, I think Ward and Daniels is very sensible. Except, let's be honest, in real life, often the biggest benefits are the ones that you cannot measure. You know you're going to get them, but you know that you can't actually measure them very easily. So although I have a lot of sympathy for Ward and Daniels, I can understand why people ignore it. But you need to know those 4 headings. In the exam, typical exam question, you've got an NPV, which the examiner has done for you. He's done all the numbers, and you are asked to comment on what he's done. And I can guarantee you, if there are 4 rows, there'll be one of each of those kinds. There'll be an observable benefit, a measurable benefit, a quantifiable benefit, and a financial benefit. And if you take out the first 3, because Ward and Daniels say you're not supposed to put them in. If you take out the first 3, I bet you the NPV turns negative. So, you need to do a sensible business case using Ward and Daniels. So you need to do a sensible method, NPV, payback, whatever it is, and you need to put the right numbers into it. So a lot of projects perhaps get done, they get undertaken where they shouldn't have done, and the reason is simply because the accountants did a poor business case for it. So, we could have turned this project down at the initial screening stage. We could have turned it down at the risk assessment. We could have turned it down at the business case stage. If it's got through those 3, the next thing we need to do is to prepare what is known as a project initiation document. And a project initiation document simply is a document that, in effect, records everything that we've already talked about, particularly the scope of the project. We've had this a number of times. I think we've had it twice or three times in past exams, companies where they do not do this. They don't write down exactly what the project is supposed to be. They don't write down the objectives. So what happens? You get to the end of the project and there's an argument. You were going to do this. No, we agreed I was going to do something else. And there is no written record anywhere to say who is right and who is wrong. So project initiation documents can save an awful lot of arguments and an awful lot of misunderstandings later on in the project. So always, always, always do them. In the exam, they don't do it, and it goes horribly wrong. Right, we've talked about the project sponsor. The project sponsor is the person, the client, that you are doing the project for. The project manager is the person who is running the project. So I've just lost my pen, there we go. The project manager is the person who is running the project. So it's the project manager's job to make sure the project meets the objectives under budget to the right standard by the deadline. That's what the project manager's job is. And again, in the exam, they often have the wrong person in charge. If you put the wrong person in charge, this project won't work. The key thing, I think, or the key things, as far as a project manager is concerned, is if you look at it, it says the skills required. Technical, you need to have technical knowledge, but all of the other ones are things like communicating, motivating, solving problems. In the exam, they will put the most technically knowledgeable person in charge. They have the most knowledge about the subject, and they're probably the worst person to be a project manager because they know all the technical stuff. They'll want to do everything themselves. You're much better off having somebody who is not as technical but is better at all these communication skills. Yep. So if you get the wrong project manager, the project's not going to work. Now, that leads us on to thinking about who we're going to have working on the project. Now again, the whole idea behind chapter 14 is really about what could go wrong. Let's try and prevent that from happening. So that's why we have the initial screening, the risk assessment and all this other stuff. You could have done everything correctly. You've done a really good business case, you've done your risk assessment, you've done all these things, but you get the wrong people working on the project and it just doesn't work properly. Now, we're going to look at the ideas of a pair of writers called Tuckman and Belbin. Both of them are from the F1 paper. They're both looking at the kinds of things you need to think about when you've got a group of people doing something. Right. Tuckman. What Tuckman is talking about is the idea that when you put a group of people together, so you would put a project team together, they go through a number of stages. Now, to a certain extent, the stages, I'll go through what the stages are, but the stages aren't actually that important. What is important is that going through these stages takes time. And remember, we've got a deadline. I can see an exam question where they don't allow time for Tuckman to occur. And because of that, the team is late actually getting started doing anything and doesn't actually finish on time. Right, the forming stage, and I'll go through that again at the end. The forming stage is when the group initially meet. They meet each other for the first time. If you've got a Tuckman question in the exam, it will be a group of people who don't know each other. Some might know each other, but not everybody will know everybody else. There will be people who've never met before that will be in that group. Now imagine, let's just imagine that we've got a multinational. So you've got a multinational, and you've put together a committee, and they're looking at some kind of, I don't know, some kind of corporate social responsibility for the company around the world. And so you've put together a committee, and it's made up of people from different parts of the world, and they're in different parts of the business. So you've got somebody from the UK who's in finance, somebody from Spain who does marketing, an American person who does IT, and blah, 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 blah. And you give them 2 days to come up with a CSR policy for the company. Tuckman would say that's bound to fail. Because the first stage the group will go through is meeting each other. Oh, who are you? Which bit do you work for? Which company do you work for? What part of the world is that? What are you particularly interested in as far as the CSR is concerned? Oh, and who are you? And it takes a while just to actually work out who everybody is and why they are on this committee at all. What is it that they are going to bring? What are their strengths? Now, that might take 2 hours. We've only got 2 days to do this. That might take 2 or 3 hours, and we haven't actually accomplished anything yet. The storming stage is where we have competition for leadership. Now, what does that mean? Everybody always thinks that their way is the best. And everybody on this committee will want things done in their way. Now, that means they'll be arguing about, for example, we might argue about who is actually going to be in charge of this committee. Maybe we have to choose somebody from our own group of people. I think I should be it. No, you think you should be it. No, somebody else. There'll be competition like that. Even if there is a chairperson, so even if there is already, that's the person that's in charge, I will still want to influence things by having things done in my way. Do you think it'd be a good idea if we start with that? Don't you think that's the first thing we should talk about? I'm trying to influence the person in charge. That's what the storming stage is. Now, that might take another half a day. Don't you think we should start with this? No, do you think we should start with that? Don't you think we should do that first? It's, all these different things, that's going to take another half a day. Who is going to have their ideas listened to and who isn't? The norming stage. This is where we agree on our behaviour. So we've got this committee, which is made up of people from around the world. We've only got 2 days to do this. Are we going to produce notes, minutes, at the end of day 1 and at the end of day 2? Are we going to produce them more frequently than that? Are we going to do it twice a day? What language are we going to use? I mean, I would assume that we would all talk in English, but some people might say, no, we're not going to talk in English. We're going to, if there's enough people here who speak French, we should be speaking in French. You have to agree what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. How often do we stop for breaks? How long do we have? All these things have to be agreed. That could be another 2 hours, getting all that agreed. Now, I reckon it would take us half a day to do the forming, half a day to do the storming, a quarter of a day to do the norming. That's a day and a quarter gone out of the 2 days that we had allocated to us. There is no way that we're actually going to get the tasks done on time. So the performing stage is where you actually carry out the task. In the exam, they will not have thought about Tuckman. They will fly all these people to the UK or wherever it is for 2 days, put them all together, and they achieve nothing. And the reason they achieve nothing is they'd only just got through the norming stage. Then they can actually start getting some work done, and it's the end of the meeting. It's the end of the 2 days. So you need to allow time for that to happen. Now, how long do you need to allow? It depends who's on your project team. If you've got a lot of people who don't know each other but will probably act in similar ways, Tuckman, you'll get through it a lot faster. If you've got lots of people who don't know each other and they do things in very different ways, Tuckman might take a week to get through. It might take 2 weeks to get through. In other situations, it might take you 20 minutes. In the exam, they won't leave enough time. The other model that we have in chapter 14 is Belbin. And Belbin says if you want to have a successful project, if you want to have a successful project team, you need a number of different personalities in there. And if you don't have these personalities, the project won't work. So, for example, you need what Belbin calls a plant. A plant is somebody who comes up with lots of ideas. Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? This would be better than what's going on at the moment. A plant comes up with lots of ideas, but they're not actually very good at getting the ideas done. They're not very practical. So you need an implementer. The implementer is the person who goes away and says, oh, okay, right, I'll do that then. Oh, all right, well, I'll do that then. So the plant has the ideas, the implementer makes it work. Now, if you have got one of those missing, you're going to have a problem. If there is no plant in your project team, then nobody's going to say, why don't we do it like this? You're just going to carry on doing the way it's always been done. If there is no implementer in there, there'll be lots of people saying, why don't we do it like this? And nobody will actually do anything about it. You need both of them. Similarly, you need a details person at the end. Just like if you have a sports team, you need a mixture of different kinds of personalities. We need a mixture of different kinds of skills. You need a mixture of different kinds of personalities if you're going to have a successful project team. Now, if you don't have all of these people, I'm not going to do the other ones, you can look it up in the study manual. If you don't have all of these different kinds of personality, there is a danger that the project won't work. In the exam, they probably will have got to the end of the project and it hasn't worked. And you have to come along and say, look, the reason it didn't work is you didn't build in enough time for Tuckman, or you didn't have a team worker, you didn't have a monitor evaluator, you didn't have this. You had some bits, but you didn't have all of them. And that's why you failed. That's why the project didn't work. So, Tuckman and Belbin. Very, very important. Now, that leads us to project milestones. All that stage so far, in fact, I'll just go back and do this. Everything so far is before the project even starts. And there's a lot of things to do before the project gets started, which is why lots of companies don't bother. They want to get on with something. They just want to start doing something. And because of that, they skip one or more of those initial stages, and then at the end, the project doesn't work, and they realise they'd have been better off doing it properly and spending time at the beginning to do it properly rather than rushing it. So we've got through all those stages, and now the project actually gets going. And obviously, you've got a deadline that you've got to meet, and there's a danger that you won't do that. So getting towards the end of the project now, and it may well be that we realise we're not going to finish. We have 4 choices. We can try and get longer. We can do less, we can not do it as well, or we can spend more money. Now let's imagine, for example, just to illustrate this, let's imagine that I have been asked to paint the room that I'm filming in. So obviously 4 walls and they're all white. It's to make the lights reflect off better. I'm not sure whether having more lighting on me is a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the idea. So I've been given 2 days to paint this room. And it's getting towards the end of day 2, or maybe getting towards the middle of the afternoon in day 2, and I realise I'm not going to finish. So I phoned my boss up and says, can I have longer? Can you give me 3 days to do it? And the boss says, no, we have to have it done by the end of today because they need to film in it tomorrow. Right, so I can't get more time. Reduce the scope. How about if I just paint the 3 walls that are behind me and to the side? The wall behind the camera, the one that I am looking at, also, I don't really need to paint that, surely, because the camera, it's not going to make any difference. The camera can't see it. I'm trying to reduce the amount of work that needs doing so that I can finish on time. And my boss says, no, all 4 walls, please. I could reduce the standard. I am supposed to paint all 4 walls with 2 coats of paint. How about if I paint them with 1 coat? Or how about I do these 2 and the back wall with 2 coats and the one at the front I just do with 1? In other words, I'm reducing the quality of the project. And the boss says no. And finally I say, right, you won't give me longer. I've got to do all the same work. I've got to do it to the same standard. Give me an extra person to help. Give me a second painter to help. Now, if you're going to run out of time, you need to change one of those 4 things. Which one do you change? You change the one which has the least risk. And remember, we talked about risk as the second stage of the project after the initial screening. You do a risk assessment. Which one is going to cause the least problems? Now, what I would do if this was me, I don't have any longer. The boss will notice if I get another worker. The boss will notice if I haven't painted all the walls. The boss might not notice if I only paint the back wall once. It will still be painted. So what I would do is I'd reduce the quality. That's what I would do. That is the least risky in this situation. But you might have to look in the exam and think, what's the least risky thing to do? Now, a big thing, and we did have a little bit of this on the December 2014 exam, if you're doing something that is for a client outside the company, or where people outside the company are going to know about it, then that one won't work. But if you're doing something that is purely internal, so in other words, a company is doing something purely for its own benefit, customers aren't going to be affected, then that one is often the easiest one to change. Just give yourself longer to do something. You can't do that if outside people know when you're supposed to be finishing. That won't work anymore. But internal, just give yourself longer to do it. So we have... That moves us on to benefits realisation. Now, one of the things that your examiner likes is this idea of benefits realisation. This was added into the syllabus a few years ago. This was not in the original December 2007 syllabus. This came in a bit later. I've got 2009, 2010 in my head. I might be wrong, but it certainly wasn't in the syllabus originally. The idea is that if you do a project, you've got some costs and you've got some benefits, and the costs will definitely happen. You know, if I was talking about changing the car, we have to spend the money to buy the car from the garage. Benefits, on the other hand, don't happen automatically. They only happen if someone makes the benefit happen. Somebody actually has to make an effort to ensure that we get the benefits that we are hoping to get. Otherwise, it won't work. Now, the example that I give to my students, I will give to you. Imagine, why do people join gyms? Why do people join fitness clubs? They join them presumably to get fit and to lose weight. As soon as you join, you have a cost. And you might have done a little cost-benefit analysis, and you might have said, well, there's the cost, but the benefit is going to be I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to be healthier, blah, 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 blah. The cost goes automatically. So every month, the gym, the fitness club, will take money out of your bank account and say, thank you very much, you've paid your fees for this month. The cost happens. Does the benefit happen automatically? On the day that the money gets taken out of your account, do you wake up in the morning saying, oh, I feel so much healthier than yesterday? No, it only happens if you make it happen. Benefits realisation, if you want good things to happen from your project, somebody has got to make sure that they happen. So if you've put down in your project, if you put down in your business case, we are going to get more customers, somebody has to go out and make sure that you will get more customers. Otherwise, all that's going to happen is you're going to spend the money and you're not going to get any benefit out of it. So benefits realisation. You can see things like benefits maps. Benefits maps, what has to happen for the benefits to occur? So what action do we need to take so that we get benefits at the end of it? Okay? Now, can I suggest, and again, I know this sounds maybe obvious, but can I suggest that for you guys, this again is very, very important. There are lots of students that I've taught that seem to think, I have booked on a course, I have paid my money, so therefore I automatically will pass the exam. I don't really need to do anything. The fact I'm on a course, I'm going to pass. Well, obviously it doesn't work like that at all. One of the things that you will find very useful as you've gone through the course, as you're going through the course, as you're doing revision, and as I say, I do hope you're doing some kind of revision, is to think about what do you have to do. I tell you lots of things. I've told you lots of things already in the course about mistakes students make when I'm marking their exams. You have to do something to make sure that you are going to benefit from what I am telling you. Don't just listen to it. Practice doing things. So what do you have to do to make sure you get all the benefits from doing this course? What are you going to have to do to make sure you pass the exam? Lots of students don't do that. And so they simply say, I've spent the money, therefore I will automatically pass the exam. And it doesn't work like that. So a benefit map is a very good thing for you to do. It might just be a list of questions for you to practice. That would be okay. But I'm sure you can see if you don't do that, then the chances are you won't get the benefit that you had hoped that you were going to get. Okay then. So the idea is that we are looking at project management, and project management is incredibly important because if you get it wrong, you will waste time and money moving from something that perhaps works. December 2007, the marketing manager, the question I've been talking about, the website they had worked, and they moved to a new website that basically didn't work because they hadn't done the things that we've said so far in chapter 14. So if you do something, project management, you do it badly, you're going to end up in a worse position than you started with. Okay then, let us take a break there. When we come back, we will finish off chapter 14. We've only got a couple of little more bits to go. Then we'll look at chapter 15, and if we get a chance, we'll look at that December 2010 question